There is a city in the desert of Jordan that was built not from stone but into stone. Not the stone laid in blocks and mortared and raised above the desert floor in the conventional architecture of the ancient world, but the stone of the living cliff face itself, carved and sculpted and hollowed from the rose-red and cream and gold and purple sandstone of the Wadi Musa Canyon system in the mountains of southern Jordan, producing a city whose facades are simultaneously architecture and geology, whose monuments are the mountain itself transformed by human hands into something of such extraordinary beauty that the 19th-century English poet John William Bergen called it the rose-red city half as old as time, and for once in the history of purple poetic exaggeration, the description was not quite strong enough. The Treasury, Al-Khazneh in Arabic, the most photographed monument in the Middle East and arguably the most spectacular facade in the ancient world. 30 meters wide and 40 meters tall, carved directly from the pink-gold sandstone cliff at the end of the Seek. The 1-kilometer-long narrow canyon whose towering walls compress the approaching visitor into a slot of shadow and then suddenly release them into the full visual impact of a monument whose scale and beauty and sheer audacity, the audacity of carving a two-story Hellenistic temple facade into a living cliff in the middle of a desert, produces in virtually every visitor the specific experience of being stopped completely by beauty. People stop walking. Their mouths open. The Treasury does this to people. It has been doing this to people for 2,000 years. But before the Treasury, before the rose-red facades and the carved tombs and the colonnaded street and the amphitheater and the high places of sacrifice and the sophisticated water management system that made a city of 30,000 people possible in a desert that receives less than 200 millimeters of rain per year. Before all of it, there were the Nabataeans. And the Nabataeans were one of the most fascinating and most underappreciated civilizations of the ancient world. The Nabataeans were Arabs, nomadic Arab pastoralists from the northwestern Arabian Peninsula who appear in the historical record for the first time in the 4th century BCE, when they successfully resisted 2 attempts by the successors of Alexander the Great to conquer their territory and seize their wealth. The wealth came from trade, from the specific geographical position of the Nabataean homeland at the intersection of the major trade routes connecting Arabia and the Far East with the Mediterranean world, the routes along which the frankincense and the myrrh and the spices and the silks and the pearls that the Greco-Roman world desperately wanted traveled from their sources to their markets. The Nabataeans were the middlemen of the ancient world's most profitable trade. They controlled the caravan routes. They knew the water sources. They knew the desert paths. They provided the security and the logistics and the commercial infrastructure that moved luxury goods from the Arabian Peninsula and India and the Far East to the ports of Gaza and Alexandria and the markets of Rome. And they charged for the service, levying the tolls and the transit fees that made Petra the wealthiest city in the ancient Near East at the height of Nabataean power in the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. The specific commercial genius of the Nabataeans, their ability to manage long-distance trade networks across the most hostile terrain in the world, to negotiate with every power from Rome to the Parthian Empire, to maintain their independence through diplomacy rather than military force whenever possible, to build the infrastructure of prosperity in a desert landscape that most civilizations would have found uninhabitable, produced the specific material conditions that made Petra possible. And Petra was only possible because of water. The specific hydraulic engineering genius that the Nabataeans developed, in a landscape that receives minimal rainfall, that is subject to flash floods of extraordinary violence, and that has no permanent rivers or lakes within its immediate geography, is the foundation of everything else. The Nabataean water management system at Petra collected rainfall from the surrounding mountains in a network of cisterns and channels and dams and pipes, distributing it throughout the city through a system so sophisticated that modern hydraulic engineers who study it express genuine admiration for the specific technical intelligence of its design. The terracotta pipes that carried water under pressure through the Seek, the narrow canyon entrance to Petra, were engineered with a specific understanding of hydraulic pressure that prevented backflow and maintained pressure through changes in gradient. The cisterns carved into the living rock throughout the city's area stored enough water to supply the population through the long dry summers. The flood diversion dams protected the Seek from the flash floods that could otherwise turn the narrow canyon into a death trap. The specific comprehensive management of a scarce and dangerous resource that the Nabataeans achieved at Petra is one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world. The city grew. From the modest settlement of the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, when the Nabataeans used the natural rock defenses of the Petra Basin as a place of refuge and storage, to the magnificent carved metropolis of the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, when Petra was at its most wealthy and most powerful, and when the great monuments that still define its character were being cut from the sandstone cliffs in one of the most sustained and most spectacular programs of rock-cut architecture in the history of human construction. The Seek. The approach to Petra from the east, the 1.5-kilometer slot canyon whose walls rise up to 80 meters above the sandy floor, whose twisting route means that the city is completely invisible until the final turn, whose specific quality of contained drama builds with every step, is one of the great theatrical approaches in the history of urban design. Whether it was designed as a theatrical approach or whether the Nabataeans simply used the natural canyon that the geology provided, the effect is the same. A visitor moving through the Seek is being prepared, whether they know it or not, for the specific visual impact of what appears at the end. The treasury appears at the end of the Seek. First a sliver, the right column of the upper story visible through the last narrow gap of the canyon. Then as the canyon opens, the full facade reveals itself with the speed of a curtain rising on the most spectacular stage set in the ancient world. The warm pink-gold sandstone blazing in the desert light. The carved Corinthian columns and the classical pediments and the urn at the top, which local Bedouin tradition said contained the treasure of a pharaoh, giving the monument its name Al-Khazneh, the treasury. The specific overwhelming quality of encountering something so large and so beautiful and so completely unexpected at the end of a narrow dark canyon. Nobody knows exactly what the treasury was. The two most likely theories are that it was the royal tomb of a Nabataean king, possibly Aretas IV, one of the greatest of the Nabataean rulers, who reigned from 9 BCE to 40 CE and under whom Petra reached its greatest prosperity, or that it was a temple. The interior is a single plain chamber. The exterior magnificence is all facade, with no interior decoration to match it. Whatever its function, its scale, and its position at the entrance to the city make it the defining monument of the Nabataean achievement. The city beyond the treasury, reached by following the widening canyon past the street of facades, the royal tombs, the colonnaded street, and the Byzantine-era church that was built within the ruins of the Nabataean city centuries after Petra's decline, is a landscape of monuments of such variety and such number that a full exploration requires days rather than hours. More than 800 individual carved monuments have been documented in the Petra archaeological zone, tombs and temples and houses and water channels and staircases and high places, and the enormous monastery of Ad-Dair, whose facade rivals the treasury in scale and surpasses it in elevation, carved into a cliff face accessible only by a climb of approximately 800 rock-cut steps. The Great Temple. The colonnaded street whose columns once carried a carved stone roof protecting the merchants and the pilgrims who moved through the city's commercial heart. The amphitheater carved into the hillside with a capacity of approximately 8,000 spectators. The Temenos Gate that marked the sacred precinct. The Casa Ulbint, the Temple of the Winged Lions, possibly dedicated to the Nabataean goddess Atagatis, standing at the end of the colonnaded street as the principal freestanding temple of the city. Petra at its peak was a complete city, not just the dramatic carved facades that the tourist photographs focus on, but a functioning urban civilization with all the infrastructure and complexity that 30,000 people required. And then Rome. The Roman Empire's relationship with the Nabataean kingdom evolved through the 1st century CE from the complex diplomatic dance of an independent client state managing its relationship with the dominant power of the Mediterranean world to the straightforward annexation that Trajan completed in 106 CE, incorporating the Nabataean kingdom into the new Roman province of Arabia Petrea. Petra became a Roman provincial city. The colonnaded street was a Roman addition, as were some of the public buildings, the Roman administrative overlay visible in the archaeological record as a layer on top of the Nabataean foundations. But the annexation changed the commercial geography. Rome's takeover of the Nabataean trade network was not simply a political and military event, it was a commercial disruption, as Roman merchants and Roman administrative interests replaced the specifically Nabataean commercial intelligence and Nabataean diplomatic networks that had managed the caravan trade. And simultaneously, the development of the maritime route through the Red Sea, which Rome was developing as an alternative to the overland Nabataean routes, progressively reduced the commercial importance of Petra as a caravan entrepot. The earthquake of 363 CE was the most dramatic single event in Petra's decline, a catastrophic seismic event that destroyed much of the city's infrastructure, damaging the water management system and the public buildings and the residential areas in ways that required an enormous reconstruction effort that the declining city could not mount. The population declined. The city contracted. The Byzantine era brought Christian churches, including the spectacular Byzantine church discovered in 1990, whose mosaic floor is one of the most complete examples of Byzantine mosaic work in Jordan. But the Christian Petra was a much smaller and much less wealthy city than the Nabataean original. The Arab conquest of the 7th century CE brought the region into the Islamic world. The Crusaders built a small fort on the high ground above the city in the 12th century. And then Petra was abandoned, or rather, its permanent population contracted to the Bedouin communities who had lived in the caves and rock-cut chambers of the Petra Basin for centuries and who continued to live there until the Jordanian government relocated them to a new village outside the archaeological zone in the 1980s in the specific complicated process of turning a living community's home into a heritage site. The wider world outside the region had largely forgotten Petra. Not the Bedouin who lived there, not the communities of the Bdul tribe who had been using the caves and the tombs of the ancient city as their homes for generations, whose knowledge of the site was encyclopedic and whose roots through the canyon system were the specific inherited knowledge of people who had been navigating these cliffs for as long as their collective memory reached. The specific European rediscovery of Petra is associated with Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, a Swiss explorer who was one of the most extraordinary linguists and cultural intelligence operatives in the history of European exploration. Born in Lausanne in 1784, Burckhardt had spent years in the Middle East mastering Arabic, learning the Quran, and living as closely as possible to the Arab communities he moved among under the Arabic name Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdullah. He was not disguised as an Arab in the superficial sense of wearing Arab clothing. He was genuinely immersed in Arab culture and language and practice to a degree that allowed him to move through communities that would have been completely closed to a recognizably European traveler. He heard about the ancient city in the mountains of Edom, the region that the Old Testament associated with the descendants of Esau and that corresponds to the Petra region of modern Jordan, from local sources while he was traveling in the area in 1812. The specific knowledge that a magnificent ancient city lay hidden in the canyon system of Wadi Musa was not a secret to the local population. It was simply unknown to the European geographical tradition. Burckhardt devised a strategy for gaining access to the site. He told his Bedouin guide that he had made a vow to sacrifice a goat at the tomb of Aaron, the prophet whose traditional burial site was on a mountain above the Petra Basin. The guide led him into the canyon. On August 22, 1812, Johann Ludwig Burckhardt became the first European in the modern era to enter Petra. He saw the Sikh. He saw the treasury. He saw the carved facades and the tombs and the colonnaded street. He understood immediately that he was in the presence of something extraordinary. He was also aware that he was in a precarious position, alone, dependent on the goodwill of his guide, in a location that European presence would not have been welcomed, and that his best strategy was to conduct his observations as quietly and as quickly as possible and leave without arousing suspicion. He could not take notes openly. He made mental observations and recorded them later. The account he eventually published, Travels in Syria and the Holy Land, published posthumously in 1822 after his death from dysentery in Cairo in 1817 at the age of 33, described Petra with the specific precision of a trained observer working from memory, and introduced the ancient Nabataean city to the European world with an impact whose reverberations are still visible in the millions of visitors who walk through the Sikh every year. The European exploration and documentation of Petra that followed Burckhardt's rediscovery accelerated through the 19th century. The French scholars Léon de Laborde and Louis Linant de Belfons produced the first detailed drawings of the site in the 1820s, drawings whose quality and precision established the visual record of Petra for European archaeology. The British scholar Edward Robinson identified the site as the biblical Sailor, the Edomite city mentioned in the Old Testament. The German scholar Alois Musel produced comprehensive surveys of the site in the early 20th century. The American archaeologist Philip Hammond conducted the first systematic excavations in the 1960s. The Brown University expedition under Judith Mackenzie produced the most comprehensive architectural survey of the site in the late 20th century. And then the film. In 1989, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade used the treasury facade as the exterior of the temple containing the Holy Grail, the most famous fictional use of an archaeological site in cinema history, and the specific cultural event that introduced Petra to a global popular audience that had not previously been aware of it. The specific irony that the world's most spectacular ancient monument needed a Hollywood adventure film to achieve true global name recognition is one of the more revealing facts about the relationship between academic archaeology and popular culture. Petra today receives approximately 1 million visitors per year, a number that has been growing steadily since the 1989 film and that accelerated dramatically after Petra was named one of the new 7 wonders of the world in 2007. The UNESCO World Heritage designation came in 1985. The management of the site, balancing the conservation needs of the irreplaceable carved sandstone facades with the economic importance of tourism to the Jordanian economy, is one of the most complex heritage management challenges in the world. The sandstone itself is the most urgent conservation challenge. The specific geological composition of the Petra sandstone, its porosity, its sensitivity to moisture, its vulnerability to the salt crystallization that occurs when moisture evaporates from the stone's interior, makes it extremely susceptible to the specific damage that millions of tourist footfalls and millions of tourist-generated moisture generate. The treasury's carved surface is visibly deteriorating in ways that were not apparent 50 years ago. The specific conservation science of sandstone preservation in desert environments is one of the most active areas of archaeological conservation research. The Bedouin who were relocated from the site in the 1980s have not been fully compensated for the loss of their ancestral home. Their traditional knowledge of the site, the roots, the water sources, the caves, the specific geographical intelligence of people who had lived in the Petra Basin for generations, is an irreplaceable resource that the official archaeological management of the site has incorporated only partially and reluctantly. The rose-red city waits. The treasury glows in the morning light as it has glowed every morning for 2,000 years. The Seek narrows and darkens and then opens onto the facade that has stopped every visitor since the Nabataean merchants first carved it from the living cliff. Some cities are built from stone. The greatest cities are built into it. Petra was always the greatest.